Okay, so we're going to set up a brand new lesson 11 application from scratch using the Express generator. That's where we're going to start. We're not going to, later we'll maybe copy a few files over from what we've done earlier, but let's start from scratch. So jump into your node folder. And just open up a command prompt. Don't create a lesson 11 folder. We'll use the Express generator to create a lesson 11 folder. I'll just go into my COMP2068 Winter 17. No, use Express lesson 11 minus E. The minus E doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, we don't want EJS views. We actually want to use HTML templates with Angular directives like we did last week. But I'll set it up with EJS as we do normally. We'll get it running that way, and then we'll move it to HTML. So just run the command Express lesson 11 minus E. You've all got the Express generator already installed. We installed it ages ago. So this should build out an Express app for us. Lesson 11. And then we'll just enter the lesson 11 directory with cd lesson 11. And we'll run npm install, which will download all the dependencies that Express needs. Now we are going to have to install Mongoose again and bring in our model and database connection. It's going to be a while before we're ready to use those things, so it doesn't really matter. We could bring those things in now, or we could do it later. We've got quite a ways to go before we're...
You can copy and paste that change.
Yeah, well, Mongoose is the only thing really that's in package.json that we don't have. I don't think there's really anything else in there. We're not going to use Passport for this. This will just be a single page public app. So really Mongoose is all we really need. So I guess we could set it up now. I mean, we should be able to launch it now. We just run npm start. Now there's our fancy Express generator application, just kind of right out of the box. Okay, so telling me there's a new update to npm, which maybe we want to install. npm I for install -g npm. We may as well update to the latest. It's telling us. So I'll stop my server and I'll run that command we see in blue, npm -i -g npm. So we're installing with npm the new npm. Well, it's saying I'm on 4.4.1 and the latest version is 4.4.4. So I'll upgrade it. I don't have to do it, but I like to keep my stuff current.
What was that for the -g?
I don't think that actually worked. Oh yeah, it did. Sorry, that was quick. So it's 4.4.1 now. If you get prompted, you can update it. If you want to ignore that, you can ignore it. No big deal. I'm in the habit when software recommends I update it, that I update it. You got an error?
It didn't work.
Oh,
It's
it's
not
four point
dash
four
comment, I think it's
one.
I dash. But the update was 4.4.4.
Ah, right.
Because I just did it without a signal. It's just NPM.
You're right. Yeah, let's.
Not dash I. No dash I.
Would help if I actually followed the commands, wouldn't it? Of course, the dash is for a switch rather than a command. So I'll update my NPM. Once NPM updates, we'll install Mongoose in our lesson 11, and we'll add --save, which will add it to package.json. And then we can maybe grab just a couple of files from our lesson 10. We can grab our model file, our book model. We can grab our configuration file that has our database connection to MLab already configured. And then the other things maybe we'll grab is our, we can grab Bootstrap as well. Although we're going to wind up moving it around a little bit later on once we add Angular. Actually, well, this is taking a bit. We may as well do that. So I'll go into lesson 10. Oops, sorry, not lesson 10. Go to lesson 9. So I'm going to grab my config folder and my models folder. There's some stuff in there we're going to be able to delete, but I'll take them as they are right now. So I'm going to copy those from lesson 9. You can copy them really from any earlier project. And I'll drop those into lesson 11 as well. Now, inside of models, we have the book model and the account model. We don't need the account model for this, so I'm just going to delete it. We're not going to use any authentication for this. So just the book model. And now I'll open up our project in my code editor. So in model, we just have our book model. I'm just going to turn my screen sharing off for a second, throw my password back into my config file. Okay, actually, I already have my password in. I'm also going to take out the Facebook and Google. In your globals file, you can take out the Facebook and Google keys. We're not using them for this. If you want to leave them in there, no problem. I'm going to take mine out. So there's our book schema. So now we want to install Mongoose with --save. So once your npm update is done, you can do npm I mongoose --save, and it'll download and install Mongoose for us. So the I is just the short form for install. You want to type install, go ahead. So Mongoose should be installed now. So really, this is just a plain Express generator site so far, with the exception that we have our config variable and we have our model. We haven't done anything else to it. So now in app.js, let's add our reference to Mongoose. I don't know if it's me or if it's my font shrunk on my settings. Let's see if I can. Kind of looks like it did. Okay, sorry, that didn't help. Is the font too small in my editor? Can people see this?
Press control and roll up on the mouse.
No, it doesn't work on this. There is a setting, I've set it, and somehow it's been set back. Yeah, that's bigger, isn't it? Okay. All right, so let's require Mongoose here. I'll use let. Actually, we don't need our model here, sorry. But after we've created connect to Mongoose, we also need to do our config file. So we'll reference Mongoose in our configuration file and we'll connect. Should be able to use NodeMon now to start. We shouldn't see any difference. As long as our app runs and there's no error, we're connected to MLab. we've kind of got our basic setup. Right now we're using views and index.ejs, but later on we're going to use an Angular. We're going to use an HTML template instead and then load our Angular component inside of it like we did last week. We had a main index HTML template, and then we had a custom Angular tag that loaded a different HTML template inside. Is anybody having any problem getting their application running and connected to MongoDB? Not expecting a lot of problems at this point because everyone's done this multiple times now. So we're going to have to make some more changes to app.js a little bit later. We can leave it for now. One of the things we're going to change is right now it's set to render EJS templates, and the views are found in the views folder. We're actually going to change both of these. We're going to change the path to the views, and we're going to change the template engine. Rather than rendering EJS, we're going to render just HTML instead. So there's our kind of basic Express setup. We're connected, and we got Mongo Express and Node running here now. So now let's go ahead and make a new folder, a new directory called client. So this is where we're going to write all of our Angular code. So we're going to have the Angular configuration files we need to set up, our views, as well as our Angular component and service. All these things are going to live inside of client. Okay. So we've got to make several files. Now, the Angular used to put these startup files, they used to be on their site that you could just download, but they've since removed them. I don't know why. They show you some samples, but we'll actually create them. I'd rather have to create them. Now, you can reuse these moving forward, but it's probably a good idea that we actually create them once rather than just download them, so we can get a little bit of understanding of what they're doing and what's in there. Oh, sorry, actually, we can't create, we'll create some, but not all of them. Jump over to GitHub. There are a few we're going to download. So go to my GitHub page. Go to the repositories. Here's the first one here says Angular starter files. So we're going to download a few things and then we'll create. So these files we're just going to download. So we can download them, or here's what I'm going to do. So I don't want to have to create this whole package.json. This is basically boilerplate. It doesn't change from one application to another. So I'm just going to take all of that and copy it. And inside of client, we're going to make a new package.json. So there's an express package.json in the root. There's a separate package.json in our client that our Angular app is going to use. So create a package.json. So we can name this anything we like. This is our startup script. So when we basically are going to have two servers running. We'll have NodeMon running our Express server, and then we'll also have the TypeScript compiler running the Lite server. So one will run on port 3000, the other will run on port 3001. And this is used to compile the TypeScript to JavaScript on the Angular front end and serve the Angular application. So here are the dependencies that it's going to install, because we're going to need most of these dependencies for our application. Angular core, HTTP forms. So we'll save that one. And we want these other files as well. Now, last week, if you're thinking, why didn't we create these last week? Well, we did, but when we created our application using the Angular CLI package. So it auto builds these. So could we use the Angular CLI? Yeah, we could, but running it inside of our Express application may get kind of messy. You could try it, but we're going to just grab these files manually. So we'll just grab the other ones. 3 others. So this one is systemjs.config.js. So I'll create that one inside my client folder as well. And again, you can just follow the name that's on the GitHub repository. If you want to try and run the Angular CLI here, you could. So this is just, package.json requires the libraries, and this just points the libraries to the appropriate NPM packages. They get smaller as we go through. Here's our TypeScript configuration, which is tsconfig.json. We'll create that one. There's actually a template for this in WebStorm, but we're going to set all these options. And the last one is typings.json. If you use the Angular CLI, you'll get these files automatically. So we have the package.json with all the dependencies. I've got my commit, but this time I'm going to browse right into the client folder, because what we need to do, well, does anybody have a guess? What's our next step going to be in configuring this? Yeah, we're going to need to do an npm install inside the client folder so that all these dependencies that package.json needs get added. So the client folder gets its own node modules folder. We go into lesson 11, but now we're going to browse into client. Just want to mention again, this isn't the only possible way you could set this up. I know some of you have already used Angular 2 in your projects, for example. So you may have taken a somewhat different approach to integrating it, and that's fine. This is just one method of doing it. So in here, we'll run npm install. Should build a node modules folder here. And all the dependencies listed in the Angular package.json will get added. What approach did you take? I know you used Angular in an assignment. How did you put them together?
I didn't make it instead of that. So I got system.config and TypeScript config. Everything is outside of the file. When I
Okay.
moving back it's like issuing.
Okay. And did you use this Angular CLI? So you also grabbed those files from Angular. Okay. I'm also just going to open up a tab to the repository we did for last week, so we can kind of review some of the stuff we built last week, because we're going to need some of those files too. So this shouldn't affect our node server. I mean, it'll restart as stuff gets added, but it's still running on localhost 3000. We haven't broken anything yet. We will break stuff, but we haven't yet. Yes.
Yeah.
Did you catch up on last week's lesson? You probably haven't installed. Have you installed typings globally? We did that in class last week.
Yeah, we did not.
Sorry?
We did not install typing.
Okay, if you're getting an error, then install typings globally. If we look at what typings is for a minute, just to give you some idea of what that means. So typings is TypeScript definition manager. It allows you to run TypeScript commands at the command line. So in effect, it will compile your TypeScript to JavaScript. So you need to have that, and it needs to be installed globally. Installed globally. Well, it doesn't matter what folder you're in, because it's not going to install it there. It's installing it globally. As we said last week, it's possible to build Angular 2 applications without TypeScript, but it's not very common. And yes, if anybody has been to the Angular site between now and last week, you may have seen the announcement that Angular, they've now gone from Angular 2, they've just announced a beta release of Angular 4. But it's way too early for us to take a look at that. They claim it's simpler, which would be nice, and less code, which would also be nice, but we'll see. It took a long time for Angular 2 to finally get a stable version.
But after installing typing,
Yep.
we have step over because they require typing JSON.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Typings JSON was one of the 4 files in that Angular starter.
I depart with JS.
Ah.
Instead of JSON. It's fine.
Yeah, it's kind of odd. 3 of them are JSON files, but this one isn't a JSON file because there's actually a JavaScript function in it, right? So JSON is data only, whereas this contains actual JavaScript code. So this one is a JS file, but the other 3 are just JSON files. They're just configuration keys and values. Okay, so NPM's finally done. So we should now have node modules inside. So if we look at the files that we made last week, you know, the Angular CLI built out all this stuff for us. So the main files that we made, well, that were here, but that we worked with at app component, that was our main TypeScript file that contained our actual logic. And it had an HTML tag definition. That was our self-defined tag where we were injecting it into our main template. And then we specified what HTML page contained the actual content. And the Angular CLI built for us this HTML page, and we then put our custom tag in here. So our Angular component loaded kind of in the middle of this, how we did this last week. So we're going to need a main index.html page. That's going to be kind of like our main template. There's quite a bit of HTML in it, so I'm going to suggest we grab that one from the starter file. So inside our client folder, these are kind of our configuration values. I'm going to create a new directory and call it app. That's typically where we're going to put our Angular stuff. If we use the CLI, it builds the app folder and all our TypeScript code goes in there. So we'll create that folder. Inside of here, let's also create a directory called views. So this is going to be the new location that holds our views. Instead of our lesson 11 views with our EJS, our main HTML template goes here inside of views. So I've got client, app, views. And in here, let's make index.html. So this will be the main page, and we'll inject the Angular component into it. So this is kind of like our container. So we'll call it index.html. Now there's a bunch of HTML we need for this. Our full template is here in my starter repo under app and views. Here's the full index.html. I'll just blow it up a bit. We don't have to have these references, but Angular recommends them for older browsers, so we should probably include them. As far as CSS, to keep it simple, just link to the Bootstrap CDN for now, rather than having Bootstrap locally for today. Okay. So we give it a title, which we can change. On our navigation bar, there's no links because it's going to be a single page. There's just basically the name of the application. That's a link to if you want to refresh it. And then here's where our code will go. We'll create a selector called app, and we'll write our Angular TypeScript and all our code in there. So let's just grab all this. Just grab the entire content. If it's easier, just click on raw, and then you just get the text. That makes it easier. And I'll just replace everything in my client app views index.html. We may have to change these paths, however, because we're down in here. So I'm not sure whether these paths are going to throw errors. We may have to go back up a couple levels to get to those paths. We'll see when we run it. I'll also change the title. We'll call it COMP2068. Call it Bookstore SPA single page application. And I'll do the same thing. Call it COMP2068 Bookstore. I've used a couple of the Bootstrap classes for the nav, and it'll just pull those styles from the CDN for now. Now, we can't really load this page yet because, well, I mean, I guess we could try. But our Angular server isn't going to work until we have at least our startup Angular files, like our TypeScript files, like main.ts, app-component.ts that we built last week. We can try it, but I don't think it's going to run. Our Express application should be unaffected still. And the other thing we actually need to do in our app.js is we now need to change this. So instead of finding the views in our views folder with EJS extensions, we want to say, no, the views live in here. They live in client app views, and we're going to use HTML instead. So after this, we're going to set the app engine for HTML. The other thing is this path is now going to become client/views. Yeah, sorry, client/app/views. So these views won't get used anymore. Our application is now configured to look in here for our views. We're also going to change our static path from public to client. Sorry, should be to client. We'll leave it there for now. We'll leave it as our client. I'm going to take out the error handling for now. For today, if things are going to crash, we'll let them crash. We're not going to use this error.ejs anyway, because we're not really using, we don't even really need this views folder here anymore. So I'm going to take that out. So now if we go to our, the other thing we need to change is our route here. Well, actually, you know what? I don't think we need to change it. Just 1 second. We may have to change that to, rather than using render, we may need to change that to render file. I'm just going to double check. In routes. Yeah, so now, right, we've pointed the path to client app views. We want to render. And we no longer have to pass in any title. So this should now be loading our index.html page rather than our views index.ejs view. So NodeMon's restarted a bunch of times. And now if we hit localhost 3000, right, now we get the HTML template instead. So I'm going to get rid of our views folder. We don't need it anymore. We can just delete that. So we've got our title, our footer, And it's saying loading because this is where we've got that app tag. So it's looking for some TypeScript component that has a selector of app that matches, right? If we view the source, it's looking for this, some component that's matched to that we called app. So the next thing we want to do is create a TypeScript file with the selector of app, like we did last week. And we're going to link that page to an HTML, to a partial, to its own HTML template. And then we want to render that in here. Okay, are people at this point? Is yours doing this? Anybody having a problem getting this to run? Okay. So now we need to build some of these files that we built last week, looking at what we did last week. So we're going to need this. We're going to need a main.ts. And maybe so this is one file we're going to need. We've already got the ts config. And then we're going to need to make a module like we did last week, an Angular module and an Angular component. That component will have a selector of app and a link to an HTML file. And then within our HTML file, we just have our HTML and our Angular code. Now, there's two ways we could do this. First one is we could create it with the same names. We could create app component and app.html like we did last week. That would work. What would be the other way we could name these? Because what we really want to do is build out a version of our bookstore. So what else might we call our component instead of app component and app.html? Yeah, we might make a book component and a books HTML page would be our other way to go about it. Okay. So we do need from our Angular starter files inside of the app folder, we need this main.ts. Now, actually, this section we don't really need. The stuff in blue, I think we can probably ignore. It'll still run without that. So we want lines 1, 2, 4, and the last one. I don't think we need our environment. So we're going to create a new file inside of app. We're creating a new TypeScript file called main. Our Angular server is going to look for the file with this name. If we try and launch the Angular server without it, we're probably going to get an error. Comment that out. I don't think we need it. So now it's looking for app module. So that's going to be the next thing that we need to create is our app module. We could grab this one online. This one, I'm going to suggest we actually code it because this is one of the primary files. So it's kind of important to understand what's happening here. So it's looking for app module.ts. So let's build that. So inside of app, new TypeScript file. called app.module. You don't have to give it an extension. Our editor will automatically assign it a .ts extension. But first, let's import the dependencies we need here. We need the browser mod, Angular's browser module, which comes from Angular platform browser. From Angular core, we need the ng module library. We will also need Angular's forms and HTTP modules. And last week, these dependencies, they were mostly here, I think, they may have been already automatically generated by the Angular CLI. I think they were. So there are our dependencies. Now, we said last week that everything in Angular 2 is component-based, so we're going to be creating a component. I guess to keep it simple, this is a single page. I'll stick with the name app component. I won't make a separate book component. So this will be the next file we've got to make. We'll make app.component.ts next. My editor's complaining because that file doesn't exist yet. As soon as we make an app component and export a class called app component, that error is going to go away. So now we're creating our main Angular module. And we're going to use some of these dependencies we've included. And now we're going to import our browser module, forms module, and HTTP module. What do you suppose the bootstrap means? What does that function mean, to bootstrap something? Yeah, it's our starting point. So the app component will be kind of the main component. Better? And then we'll just export this as a class. If I open up our app module last week that we built with the Angular CLI, sorry, I'll put the code back up. Should look pretty much So really the same file. So we'll want to build app component.ts next because our module requires our component. Our component is really where most of our logic is going to go. Well, actually, it's where some of our logic is going to go. Remember we talked about last week how this was going to work? So we have HTML as the UI. We've got MongoDB as the data store. We've still got our model. So that's Node. We've still got our Express controller. And we said there were two layers in here. So what are the two layers we're building here? So this one is our component. Yep, we're going to build that next. So the component, right, it reads is loaded into a certain spot in our template based on an HTML selector, and it loads a partial HTML view inside. So here it's kind of our template, our main template, and then we might have a partial that our component injects inside. So what's the other layer? So then we're going to write the Angular service. This is basically an API that connects our Angular component and our Express backend. It's a bridge in between them. And this is what will issue the get, post, put, and delete requests to our backend. Okay, so in effect, this is our front end, this is our client. That's why all that stuff's going to live inside the client folder. And there's our backend. So we're going to need to create our Angular component with our partial HTML. Thank you. And then we'll create the service that serves as the bridge between the client end and server end of things. Then we can start actually making calls to MongoDB and rendering data and working with the data. So we want to now create, again, inside of the app folder, we want to create app.component. The module is, it declares it's sort of the startup point. So we can't load the component directly. This is what tells Angular what component to render first in effect and what dependencies are needed for it.
Do we need those form codes, like the form modules?
It's a good question. If we were not using forms, let's look. It's a good question. My assumption is no, we probably wouldn't, but we want a form. But let's actually have a look at that. Look at the library itself. Let's look at their docs. So I don't think we would need it if we weren't going to build a form. But we do want a form because we want to be able to add and edit. And let's look at the HTTP module as well. So this is going to be required because our front end needs to make HTTP requests to the API in the back end, right? Our express routes, they are set up to handle GET and POST, for example, but we need some way of executing those requests. So we need this module in order to execute any requests on the back end.
So the browser is also making requests, and the Angular app is also making requests.
Well, the Angular app makes HTTP requests to the server, but it needs this module in order to, it needs this dependency, or it can't issue a GET or a POST request anywhere. We need those dependencies. If we were, let's say we just, like last week, where we had no real backend at all, was just HTML and Angular directives, I suppose if we took those out of what we did last week, I think it would probably still work. Because I don't think we ever in our code, I don't think we ever actually used those. If we think about, if we look at what we did last week. So if we go into the component, yeah, we never actually used a form or made any HTTP request. So probably we could go into, be worth trying. I could probably go into my module, probably remove those dependencies and those imports, and it should still run because we never actually used them. It's a good idea to have them though, because chances are if we're building a web application, you know, if we're using Angular, probably there is a back end and we're working with data. So we'll probably want them. That answer your question? Okay, but good question. Thank you for raising that. Okay. So let's make app.component. So inside of app, new TypeScript file called app.component. The import component class which is in Angular core. Would make sense since the component is the primary construct that Angular uses. Not surprising that it's in the core library. So we'll create a component. Selector should we give? Remember, this is where we're defining our own HTML tag so we can inject our Angular component into an HTML template. Yeah. So inside of our index.html, whatever tag we used here, we need to match that same tag, because this tag will then load our component in this space. So our selector will be app. And now we've got a couple options for the HTML we want to display. If we just want to display some basic HTML text, we could actually put it in right here. We'll do that first. But last week we actually specified a template URL. So this little app component will load in part of an HTML page. Just for starters, we'll just put it in this way. We'll put in a template. So we'll go here. We'll get rid of this and we'll put in a URL path instead that'll contain all of our HTML. We'll just see if this works. And then we'll export the class. And we'll give it a title, a public title property that we can render. Just say So last week we created our app component. We had multiple properties that we exported. We had like a title, a price. We had an array of books. So this is just a class. So let's just compare it to what we had last week in our app component. So we'll build our, and now notice in our app module that error goes away. Now that we have a component, our reference is working. But everything is still static, but now we want to actually try and launch our Angular server. So things still run here. And notice it now loads my component. My component has a template. So it's actually showing up already. Right, if I change something, I'll add some HTML to my template. Right, so it's just right now loading our components loading, and our components just rendering some static HTML. It's not actually loading its own HTML page yet. So we're not going to keep this template. We're going to remove it, and we're going to specify a template URL instead. So we have at least, we still don't have our service and our backend part, but now we can load our Angular application, and our component is loading successfully inside of our Node application. Nick? Yep. Actually, Pranav, I'm going to try what you suggested. I'm going to comment out those two references here, see what happens. I don't think it's going to make any difference at this point. Shouldn't make any difference until we start trying to call our service. I'll remove those and move those for a minute. No problem. So I'll leave them in because we're going to want them. Okay, there's an error in the code editor, or you get it in your command line?
In the command line.
What is the...
It says experimental code for decorators is a feature that is subject to change in a future release.
Okay, let me come have a look. just a warning.
Go to your app.js for a minute.
It's just a warning, so it shouldn't prevent it from running. Now it's almost time for us to take a break. I'm just going to change this template. Instead of setting up a template here, we instead want to load a partial. We want to load a page that will inject into our overall template. So it's kind of the opposite of the way we did templating with EJS. With EJS, we built out each view and we included a header and a footer partial. We're doing the opposite here. We're building one HTML template, that's our index, that has the header and footer, and we're just injecting an Angular component in the middle. So our partials are kind of going the other way around. So I'm going to take this template and change it from template to template URL. And our template URL will be app.component.html. Now, what will happen if I go back to the browser now? Shows loading. Why does it show loading? Why isn't it? The word loading got replaced before. Why isn't it getting replaced now?
Because we don't have one.
Yeah, because it's trying to it's loading our component, but our component's looking for app component.html, which doesn't exist, and we can see it here. It's now trying to run app component.html, but we haven't built that file yet. Soon as we build that file, whatever HTML and with any Angular tags we put in there, that's going to show up. Inside of app, don't put it in views. I mean, well, actually, hang on a minute. Maybe we should. Okay, actually, let's change this. Well, I haven't even created it yet. I'm just debating whether we should put it in views and maybe call it books. Maybe we'll do that. So even though we called the component app, let's create a view. Yes. Well, it could be partial. It depends how you want to organize it. We could create a views and partials because our book HTML is a partial, right? It's not a full page. It just contains the content and it gets injected into our template. Just depends how we want to structure the files. I'll just put it in view. We're only going to have 2 pages, so I'm comfortable putting both of them in views. So I'll make an HTML file. You know what? We'll call it books.html. And I'll change this component. I have to think about my path. Yeah, you're right. Thank you. I probably should have called my component book component rather than app component, and we could have just bootstrapped that. So inside of books, we can take all this stuff out because it's getting injected into our index view. So we don't need all of this HTML wrapping. So let's display the title from our component in an H1 tag that's centered. So now, rather than just sending HTML directly, we're loading an HTML template. So we're injecting our books HTML partial into our overall index. So index is the main template, the main container. And our app tag is being used to load our app component, which renders our books.html. So most of our setup is pretty much done now. We started Express from scratch. We've configured Angular 2 to run. We've got our templates running. So we have 3 pieces left to do. We won't do them all today. This will carry on into next week. The first thing we want to do when this page loads, we're going to add to our, we're going to add an HTML table. Our component is going to make a GET call to our Angular service, which will call our Express controller to fetch the list of books, and we're going to use Angular to render those, Angular and HTML. No EJS on our front end at all. So that'll be time by time for us to take a break. That's what we're going to do first. If we can get that to work, then we'll use the forms module to be able to add a form above the list of books. And when we add, we'll want to refresh the list of books without the page reloading. It'll appear instantly on the page as soon as the user clicks the save button. We'll see if we have time to get both of those. We may only get the GET working today, and that's fine if we do. Then next week we can pick up, build the form, and we'll use the same form for adding and editing. Sure. Okay. I'm going to stop the video stream. I will upload what we've done so far to GitHub, and we'll come back at 12:40.